Since the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, relations between Russia and Ukraine have been tense. Since it served as the Soviet Union's breadbasket, Ukraine has remained crucial to Russia politically, militarily, and economically. A difficult issue entrenched in the history of the area is why there is a disagreement on whether or not Ukraine is under its sovereign authority. For a large portion of the plot, it has taken more than 1,000 years to develop. Since Ukraine did not exist, at least not as a sovereign independent nation, the term will be used here to refer to the area around Kyiv that played a crucial role in the narrative. Crimea plays a significant role in the narrative as well, and the history of the region is intertwined with that of Russia and Ukraine. If you want to be notified of new videos, subscribe to AWZ and click the notification icon. Kyiv is now the nation of Ukraine's capital. It served as the administrative center of the so-called Kievan Rus state a millennium ago. By the 12th century, Kyiv had earned the moniker Mother of the Cities, thus designating it as the seat of the Kievan Rus kingdom. Grand Princes of Kyiv was the title given to the area's rulers. Kyiv has a hold over the collective imaginations of individuals outside of modern Ukraine because of its association with the early legacy of the Russian people as the origin of the Russian people. It was crucial to the formation of Russia, but it is currently outside its borders. People are always prepared to battle over locations that impose a draw on them, and this 1,000-year-old link is the first step in explaining why there are problems now. Since 1371, Russia had been gradually coming together from many states. Crimea, which had previously been a Khanate, had previously been a part of the Ottoman Empire, but after the Ottoman-Russian War, Crimea had been briefly independent before being annexed by Russia on Catherine the Great's orders in 1783. This action was not resisted by the Tatars of the Crimea, and it was formally recognized by the Ottoman Empire. The Crimean War racked the region from October 1853 to February 1856. The Ottoman Empire, France, and the United Kingdom formed a coalition against the Russian Empire. The Crimean War was lost by the Russian Empire, and the Treaty of Paris, which was signed on March 30, 1856, forbade Russia from stationing naval forces in the Black Sea. The Russian Empire's shame prompted internal reforms and modernization among the European countries in an effort not to fall behind. The situation in Ukraine remained unstable, so in 1876 the 1804 prohibition on teaching the language was expanded to forbid the printing or importation of books, the staging of plays, and the giving of lectures in Ukrainian. Ukraine temporarily enjoyed independence after the Russian Revolution in 1917, but it quickly joined the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, which would dominate world politics for the majority of the rest of the 20th century. Russia and Ukraine were two of the signatories to the USSR's founding charter in 1922, and thanks to its expansive, fertile plains, the two countries would come to be known as the USSR's breadbasket since they provided the country with food and grain. That fact only served to heighten the shock of what followed. The Holodomor was a genocide committed by the Stalinist regime of the Ukraine through a state-sponsored starvation. To support Stalin's ambitions, harvests were taken and sold on international markets. Pets and animals were evaluated. Up to 4 million Ukrainians died of malnutrition because Soviet soldiers made sure that what was left was concealed from the populace. German troops crossed the border into Ukraine on June 22, 1941, and took control of the country by November. As a result, 4 million Ukrainians were evacuated to the east. When in power, the Nazis broke their commitment to support an independent Ukraine while still encouraging cooperation. Between 1941 and 1944, Nazi soldiers slaughtered over 1.5 million Jews living in Ukraine. The counteroffensive swept across Ukraine in the months following the USSR's victory at the Battle of Stalingrad in early 1943, retaking Kiev in November of that same year. The battle for western Ukraine was brutal and violent, and by the end of October 1944, Nazi Germany had been completely driven out. Between 5 and 7 million people died in Ukraine during World War II. Around 1 million additional people perished in the famine of 1946 to 1947, and pre-war levels of food production were not recovered until the 1960s. USSR handed up control of Crimea to Soviet Ukraine in 1954. Perhaps there was a perception that, as long as the USSR was strong, it didn't matter whether Soviet state controlled the region, but the action really set up issues for a day when the Soviet Union would no longer exist. The Chernobyl nuclear accident occurred in Ukraine on April 26, 1986, during a test process on reactor number 4. A power reduction made the reactor unstable, and the core melted down. An explosion that followed destroyed the facility. Chernobyl and the 2011 Fukushima disaster are the only two nuclear disasters that have received the top rating. The Chernobyl explosion resulted in continued health problems for the region, and the exclusion zone stretched more than 2,500 square kilometers. One of the contributing factors to the fall of the USSR has been cited as Chernobyl. The final Secretary General of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, claimed it was a turning moment that allowed for much more freedom of expression to the point that the status quo could no longer be sustained, shattering trust in the Soviet authority. 1991, 5 years later, saw the end of the Soviet Union. Ukraine was acknowledged as an independent state, at least on the surface, because it was one of the parties to the agreement dissolving the Union. Elections and a referendum both took place in the same year. Ukraine rose to the position of third largest nuclear weapon owner in the world following the fall of the Soviet Union. Although it had the ability to produce more warheads, Russia held the software that controlled them. In exchange for Ukraine turning over most of its nuclear capability to Russia and Western powers agreed to recognize and accept Ukraine's independent sovereign status. The elimination of the remaining weapons was mandated by the Budapest Memorandum on Security Guarantees in 1994. In 2004, amid protests over a rigged presidential election, the Orange Revolution occurred. The Maidan Revolution, also known as the Revolution of Dignity, started in 2014 as a result of President Yanukovych's reluctance to sign a treaty that would have established a political association and free trade agreement with the EU. 18 police officers were among the 130 people killed, and the revolution resulted in early presidential elections. Fighting broke out in the Donbass region that year, which is still ongoing today. This pro-Russian uprising in eastern Ukraine, which Russia is suspected of sponsoring, helped to cement the country's sense of national identity and independence from Moscow. In 2014, Russia annexed Crimea, which had been a part of Ukraine since 1954. Crimea's ports on the Black Sea maintain its military and geopolitical importance. It's also a location that people have a positive opinion of, going back to the Soviet era when it served as a vacation spot. Currently, Russia still controls Crimea, but the international community does not acknowledge its control. Ukraine is still experiencing upheaval that began in 2014. It was made worse in 2019 by a reform to the Ukrainian constitution that established stronger ties with NATO and the EU. This action verified Russian concerns that Western European and American influence on its borders would lead to an increase in regional tensions. For the first time in 20 years, Ukraine's law was altered to permit the selling of farmland on July 1, 2021. The original restriction had been implemented to avoid a situation similar to the oligarchy takeover that occurred in Russia after the Soviet Union's demise. It provided a tremendous opportunity for Ukraine and Ukrainians to fill a void in the world's food supply chains brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic. Beginning in 2022, Ukraine was the fourth largest maize exporter in the world, sending grain to nations including Morocco, Bangladesh, and Indonesia. However, the country's corn yields were inferior to those of the United States and the European Union, leaving opportunity for development. Rich Gulf states were especially interested in food imports from Ukraine. All of this resulted in a dramatic increase in stock price for the former Soviet Union breadbasket, which had unintended repercussions. Russia and Ukraine have always had a complicated relationship that is based on a frequent shared past. For a long time, Russia treated Ukraine more like a province than a separate country. Ukraine has sought greater links with the West, including with NATO and the EU, to counterbalance this perceived attack on its independence, which Russia has seen as a threat to its own security. Beyond a common ancestry, Russia retains a romantic attachment to the former Russian nations that were centered in Kiev, Ukraine. Fears that it would ally with NATO and the EU are seen as a threat to Russia because it has served as a buffer between that country and Western states. Russia's concerns about who controls Ukraine frequently leave little room in its thinking for an independent sovereign state, despite the fact that the country has an economy based on food production and is nevertheless crucial from both an economic and a geopolitical standpoint. In some ways, Ukraine in 2022 will resemble Cuba in the 1960s for Russia. It may be difficult to find a long-term sustainable solution to the relationship between Ukraine and Russia that all sides can live with after the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, which narrowly prevented a nuclear war on a global scale. Because doing so is necessary to prevent a repetition of the worst facets of 20th century history. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more like it, subscribe to AWZ.